everybody, it's Janet with Sugar Shine Designs, and today I'm going to show you how to make this tri-fold anniversary card. Now I've used a number of CottageCutz dies here, and first of all a round nested circle made the window and the frame, and then I used that for the background of my stamp sentiment. Then we used a Cuttlebug embossing folder. Inside I made the background with a stamp in a variety of inks, and we'll take a closer look at the cute new Honeymoon Car Die. And then inside I simply made a mat with another nested shaped die and stamped my final greeting there. So let's take a look at this card and how it goes together. My first step was to create the background, and I used 3 ombre inks on top of this new Hero Art stamp called Brushstroke Bold Prints, and it's a faux brushstroke background. So for someone like me who's not really talented at brush stroking or not feeling that comfortable with it, this seemed like a very good idea, and I did enjoy using it. Now I used yellows first, then you saw me use some pinks, and finally I went on top with some blues and purples. Then I went back with some yellows again just to get some of that back in. Once that was done, I wanted a little bit of metallic look to it, so I added some gold and silver memento inks. And I did that a few times because it was a very subtle imprint on this, and I wanted a little bit more boldness to it. So I did it 2 or 3 times, I think. You'll see that here. You don't really pick it up in this video, but when you look at the pictures in the beginning of my video, you can really see that shimmer from the gold and silver ink. To finish this off, I added about 4 pumps of white glimmer mist, also from Hero Arts, and set that aside to dry. Now, speaking of Hero Arts, this is the stamp set I used. It's a new release for August, and I used a couple of these different sentiments, like the one in the corner here, Love You More Than All the Stars, but I used a Dreaming of You as well. So the next thing to do is to create the sentiment for the front of the card, and I already stamped the Love You More Than All the Stars in purple and the stars themselves that I arranged here in yellow ink. And then I'm following up with clear ink. This is Versamark, which then I'll use clear embossing powder over the top of and melt that with my heat gun. In most cases, I prefer to stamp my images in colored ink, and then I follow up like this with Versamark and clear embossing powder. And this gives a really sharp and strong image, and also I don't have to worry about colored powder melting on my paper. So it's way more forgiving, it's a lot more economical, and it takes a lot less room in your craft room. So it's a win-win-win in my book. The next step was to create the mat for my front sentiment. And to do so, I started by cutting a mat out of the Nested Stitch Scallop Rectangle Set. Then I took my sentiment and measured the approximate width I was going to need my mat to be. And then I laid that out on top of the paper mat I'd already cut with the same die, and ran that through the die cutter again. That way I had a mat that was pretty close to what I needed. Now, I knew I was going to have to trim my sentiment a little bit to make it all work, but I knew that I was approximately in the right neighborhood. Now, I noticed that when the die cut the second time, the stitch lines crossed in the corners, and I wanted to get rid of that so that it was a neater look. So you'll see me cutting those edges off. Then I took a look at my sentiment, and I had to trim the width of that just a little bit more because I wanted to see the pretty stitching on the top and bottom of the mat along with my sentiment. So once that was figured out, I cut my edges again to be approximately the right width. There's just a couple things left to do to finish off this embellishment. To help tie everything together, I use my Spectrum Noir marker on the edges of the mat. This is the same color that you'll see in my Honeymoon Car Die, and it just, again, helps tie it together. Once that was done, I could secure my sentiment on top with some ATG gun, and then you'll see that I trimmed it to get the edges just perfect. Now I have to apologize because you'll notice that I put this sentiment on the mat crooked. I don't know how I didn't notice that at the time, but I did do it, so I apologize for that, and would encourage you to be a little more cognizant of making sure that's straight. Here's my card base. It's 5.5 by 12 with a score mark on each side at 4 inches, and when you fold this, this creates the trifold. I used a 2-sided paper here just to create a nice effect when it's opened. Let's take a minute now and look at the Honeymoon Car die cut I prepared earlier. I cut this all out of white cardstock and then used my Spectrum Noir markers to color it all up. And then I used the nested scallop circle set to figure out approximately where I wanted my window to be so that it would show the car, but also have enough room for my sentiment. At the same time I cut the window out on the base of the card, I'm going to take the next largest circle shape and cut that out using white cardstock. And this is what's going to create the frame for the window here. So the first pass cuts the window, and I'll run this through another time using the die that I used to create the window, and I'll center that on top of the larger circle that I cut. When this is run through, it's going to cut the center out, and therefore you have a frame, and this is going to fit just perfectly on the window I cut previously. Before I can finish attaching the frame and the sentiment, I have to do the embossing on the front panel. And so I did this with a Cuttlebug folder, and I lined it up so that the edge of the folder matches the first score line. Now the Cuttlebug folder is a little bit short of 5.5 inches, so you'll see the embossing stops short of the bottom of the card. However, the embellishment I'm putting on top covers all of that up for the most part, and so it's not an issue in this particular case. So now that the embossing is done, you can see that the sentiment and the frame all fit nicely on the front, and we're ready to place the car inside the second panel. To prepare for this, I first had to cut down that 6x6 panel that I made earlier into a 4x5.5 inch panel and glue that in with ATG, and then I had a perfect background to place the car. Now I love this car. It is so cute with the balloons and the little cans, and I really loved working with it. I just cut it in white and colored everything in the Spectrum Noir markers. You might also notice that I colored the frame as well on the front at this point to coordinate with the pink in the car. I went ahead and made this sentiment embellishment for the second panel here, much like I did the first one, except this time I was able to use the smallest nested stitch scalloped rectangle in the set to hold the sentiment. So once that was ready, I just attached it in the card, as you can see there. I felt the print of the card needed a little extra something, so I used these 3 bird stamps in that Hero Art set I showed you earlier. I stamped them in purple ink and then used clear embossing powder over the top, so in real life they have a bit of a sheen and it adds a nice touch. At this point, the only thing I really have left to do is the inside panel, and I created that out of the largest nested stitch scalloped rectangle. The sentiments come from handwritten notes from Avery L. and a close to my heart set called From Me to You. That finishes up the happy anniversary card featuring CottageCutz for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give me a thumbs up, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you soon. Until then, keep crafting. Bye.